Welcome back to friends and to occasional listeners also of Ancora Italia TV. My name is Paola Amaldi and I'm your host for the program The Invisible Cities. Today we discuss the progressive penetration of the financial entities like banking cartels, foundations, Rockefeller, Bill and Melinda Gates, large investment firms like Vanguard, BlackRock. So the progressive penetration into the political institutions, thus depriving them of their original intent and meanings, because in principle they should represent, yes, the needs of citizens, but also the divergent and conflicting interests of citizens of the respective countries. And today that doesn't seem to be the case. The parliament, for example, seems to essentially support a one whole voice. We discuss this and many more in the context of South Africa, thanks to the detailed and courageous investigative work of the South African microbiologist Fahrie Hassan. Fahrie is a molecular biologist with a Master of Science in Chemical Pathology from the University of Cape Town, and his specialist background is molecular genetics, biochemistry, enzymology, and immunology. Medical natural scientist in departments of chemical pathology, University of Cape Town Medical School is his current position, and Red Cross Children's Hospital. Fahrie, a very warm welcome to Ancora Italia TV, and it's a real honor and privilege to hold the conversation with you today.
Thank you very much, Paola. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Fahrie, my first question is, your work started from, in fact, investigating conflict of interest within South African institutions, particularly within organizations and bodies in charge of, and I use a very broad term here, the management of public health policies. Please help us to understand and to learn better about the progressive infiltration into South African political and societal institutions.
Yes, thank you for that, Paola. Much appreciated. And is it okay if I share my screen?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
So let me go ahead. Is that coming up? Is that
Yes.
Is that show?
Yes, very good. Excellent.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me go to slideshow. Paola, that's probably better.
Yes.
Right. So can you see that, Paola?
Yes, it's very clear.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Wonderful. So this slide, so if I may start with my interest in conflicts of interest, and as you rightly introduced, how governments have been taken over and basically captured in order to do the bidding of the global elite, was really tempered by the fact I started as a molecular biologist, basically a scientist that was interested in researching the COVID-19. I'm sure everybody goes back 3 years to March 20. I think it was the 12th of March 2020, when Tedros Ghebreyesus announced that there's a global pandemic of COVID, and that PCR was going to be used, the preliminary chain reaction was going to be used as a test for detecting COVID-19. Of course, me being a molecular biologist, PCR was my bread and butter. I knew he was talking nonsense, because PCR cannot be used as a diagnostic tool. Then my research morphed into researching the entire COVID science, the science around COVID. And of course, by that time, I started writing articles, pointing out the fallacy and the problem with the science, the way it's being interpreted. And the more and more I went into the research of science, I knew that there was something not right, that the science is not panning out, and the medical profession has just capitulated and accepted the mainstream WHO line of thinking. Now the question came up to me was, how did they do this? How could the medical profession and my fraternity, the scientific community, just capitulate? Isn't, after all, science they endeavored to find truth in science. But the opposite was what I discovered, is that in fact, science was being suppressed, and many voices that started pointing this out was being suppressed. So there came in also the censorship, and then the media was also, in fact, towing the line with governments, so it was, now you had the confluence of interests. You had the government following the WHO line, you had the scientists and the medical profession following, and you had the media following the WHO, the mainstream narrative. So I thought something is amiss. Then I started following, I said, now follow the money. I started following the money and said, who is this? And then it always ended up at the entity called the World Economic Forum, right, with Klaus Schwab. And as you look at this slide, it very beautifully lays out the hierarchy, of how they've set up the system to impose this whole COVID narrative on this world community. And if you look at the policy makers, so you have the central banks, the Bank of International Settlements. So this is where, of course, the movers and shakers and the global elite really make the decisions, that's going to affect the world. And then they call together once a year, once a year, they call together all the major role players at the World Economic Forum meeting, right? And now many people would argue that, this is just a meeting place for a group of people that's interested in dealing with the world problems and so on, and then they leave. But there's a very important, when you study the World Economic Forum website and you go there and then you find the partners to the World Economic Forum. And when you look at the caption, when the introductory landing page to the World Economic Forum partners, you find there's a statement there that says the partners to the World Economic Forum are the individual organizations or entities that will implement the World Economic Forum plans wherever they find themselves. They will be basically the conduits for imposing World Economic Forum hegemony on the world. So when I understood that principle, I said, now, okay, the World Economic Forum COVID-19 response is then ties in with the World Health Organization appropriately, all their mission statement and everything. So that means that everything comes together there, so the movers and shakers that meet at the World Economic Forum meetings are the politicians, they're the media, they're the NGOs, they're the philanthropic organizations such as the Bill and the Gates Fund, etc., etc. And then, I'm not going to go into the Council of Foreign Relations. They also play a major role, Club of Rome, Chatham House, all these think tanks, as I call it, play a major role, but for brevity's sake, I'm going to continue. So the policy distributors, meaning, as I've mentioned, the partners of the World Economic Forum now implement all their policies. And these are the main entities that are the implementers, which is United Nations, IMF, World Bank, WHO, of course, comes in the philanthropic organizations such as Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, etc., etc. And of course, as you can see, and then where we're going to be focusing today is mainly the national governments and how entities like SAGE, for instance, because later you also mentioned that you would like to look at later on at the international health regulations, the World Health Organization and all their subsidiaries and etc., etc. Anyway, so clearly what is coming out is that the World Health Organization and the World Bank then directs governments to agree to certain protocols and implementation of certain programs in their various countries, right? And how do they do this? Now, let me go to the next slide. Now, everybody, if they know what happened in South Africa, right? They know this individual on the left-hand side. Paul, can you see my cursor, right? They know this man. This is none other than, in the South African context, this is none other than Nelson Mandela, right? Now, this picture paints 1,000 words. In the South African context, it paints 1,000 words. Now, we have to go back, in the South African context, we have to go back to 1994, when South Africa got the democracy from, having fought against the apartheid system, of white-dominated control and so on, imposing, the rights of the black community was taken away. And after 40, 50 years of rule, finally it came to an end in 1994, right? So the question, of course, on everybody's lips was this the turning point for South Africa? Did the people of South Africa then attain their freedom and the democracy and the economic freedoms, and was there parity and equality now back, and so on? The whole constant notion of freedom of association, freedom of equality by the law, so on, etc. Did we achieve that? I think this picture paints 1,000 words. Here he's standing next to Klaus Schwab at the 1990 meeting. This is an indication that Nelson Mandela, in fact, made an agreement with the global elites that the global elite and its representatives in South Africa would maintain all their privileges and everything. And what would then happen? You would have a trickle-down effect, meaning the South African public would have, and the disenfranchised, previously disenfranchised, the poor people, would have to, eat at the trough, meaning the people were not really free. They weren't freed in 1994. But what does it mean in context of the bigger picture? In South African context, coming to the COVID-19 era now. This picture tells us that all the politicians and all the political elite have basically kowtowed to the global elites to basically implement all their programs, and that Nelson Mandela had started and initiated a program that would ensure that the South African public would be subjected to the World Health Organization and World Economic Forum program. And here is evidence of this, right? So this is South African government captured by the global elite. Here is I put together a list of World Economic Forum young global leaders from 1993. Now remember I said 1994 was the South African people allegedly got their liberation from the white apartheid system. And so how does this tie in? The World Economic Forum, and right at the top, you'll see there that Cyril Ramaphosa, the present South African president, was inducted into the World Economic Forum Young Leaders in 1993 already. Way before, more than a year before the new democratic system was established. So Cyril Ramaphosa was targeted and identified as their representative already way. So the fact that now in 2017 he was elected as president of South Africa, meaning about 30 years later, he was groomed already. And this is why when we later on look at South Africa's response to COVID-19 and Cyril Ramaphosa being the president, he just capitulated. He just implemented everything. In fact, I'm not sure in Italy, but we had one of the, I think in Italy as well, we had one of the most heaviest lockdown in Africa, in fact, I'm sure you in Italy as well was the issue, so we're all familiar when we speak about COVID-19 lockdown. Cyril Ramaphosa imposed a draconian lockdown, meaning implementing the World Economic Forum policies. But what was very interesting is that if you can see there's my cursor. Can you see my cursor, Paola? there, Trevor Manuel, for those who may not know the South African landscape, Trevor Manuel was the former Minister of Finance of South Africa. Now, I mean, when we speak, you earlier spoke and introduced by saying how the banking system has basically undermined South Africa. Trevor Manuel was a former Minister of Finance of South Africa. After he stepped down as Minister of Finance, we then joined the Rothschild Group. Yeah. So our South African government is basically, what I'm trying to get across is we've basically been captured by the world global elite, and as you can see, became the senior advisor, right, to the Rothschild. If you look at the date, in 1994, he was elected as a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader in 1994, the same year that we got our democracy. So clearly from this, what I'm trying to get across is that South Africa is not, or the public is not represented by their politicians anymore. They are represented by basically puppets of the global elites imposing their will on South Africa. And just lastly, I mean, before we continue to the next slide, because I know time is of the essence, you'll see again in yellow, Tito Mboweni. He was the South African Minister of Finance from 2018 to 2021. He was, in fact, elected to the World Economic Forum Young Global Leader in 1995 already. So clearly, I mean, I don't need to continue further with this. Effectively, South African political scene has basically been captured by the World Economic Forum, in a sense. So let me continue further.
Sorry, I'd like to make a comment following your observations. It seems that the progressive infiltration by the big financial cartels has been planning for a long time. It's not just a matter of a couple of years. And it looks as though, in fact, this transition from South Africa being controlled by the apartheid regime into South Africa being controlled by the big finance has been going on, presumably, even before Mandela was liberated.
Indeed. I mean, as I said, this discussion that we're having needs a much broader discussion on the role of the financial interests in South Africa, because, in South Africa, for those who may not be aware, and I'm sure it's probably the same in Italy and various, other countries and so on. But in South Africa, I give you an example that I earlier mentioned Cyril Ramaphosa, the present president of South Africa, being inducted in 2017. Now, I don't have the slides, so I'll just explain. Maybe at a later stage we can look more in depth at this aspect that I'm going to mention. Is that Cyril Ramaphosa was inducted as the president of South Africa in 2017, but in order to get him elected, a 1 billion rand was raised, from private concerns in order to get him elected. And these entities, for those who don't know the South African scene, one of the biggest companies in South Africa, mining companies, is Anglo American, and it's run by it's been run for the last 100 years, decided 20, by the family, the Oppenheimer family, Ernest Oppenheimer, who basically is beholden, was put into that position by the Rothschild, Nathan Rothschild, of the UK fame, Nathan Rothschild. So they are actually representatives of the Rothschilds, basically, and they gave something like 10 million, it is said, towards the election of Cyril Ramaphosa. Then you have another entity called the Ruperts, Anton Ruperts, who basically is the largest Afrikaner family, the richest Afrikaner family in South Africa, and they run the Remgro group, right? And they also donated to South Africa. And of course, by the way, I may mention here that the Ruperts got their money from the Oppenheimers, basically, and so on, etc. So with the Ruperts in tandem, the Oppenheimers in tandem, they basically gave money towards what they call the Solidarity Fund. There was a Solidarity Fund that was raised for COVID-19 rollout. And they gave, in fact, between them, between the Rembo group and the Anglo-American group, which is the Rothschild, they gave about R1 billion towards the Solidarity Fund. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the South African government, having been captured by global elites and getting money for rolling out COVID-19 regulations, got money also from the same interests. So you can see how the conflicts of interests have basically imposed a will on South Africa, where the people don't have a say anymore in how the country is run. And so this is basically what has transpired in South Africa. I just want to make a point here that where was it now? Yeah. So here I've got a earlier I mentioned. Let me just go back to that. So remember I said Trevor Manuel here. You can see where my cursor is pointing. Trevor Manuel. He was a former Minister of Finance. Why was this individual so important? Because you can see here, right at the top, Cyril Ramaphosa appointed Trevor Manuel, this individual here, as the African Union Special Envoy on COVID-19. Can you imagine it? The person, the Rothschild representative of the country, is appointed by the President of South Africa to become the African Union Special Envoy on COVID-19 to advise not just South Africa, but African governments on how they should approach the COVID-19 vis-a-vis COVID-19 treatments, lockdown measures, COVID vaccine rollouts, etc., etc. So we put our trust in a person like this, and so on. So it shows that, of course, what I'm trying to get across is that it shows that the South African president had no say in it. He was told to do this by the Rothschilds. I'm trying to explain, I'm sure I'm getting across the concept to the television, how much the South African government is totally and utterly captured, by the global elite. And here is the individual. I just want to explain to you further. So the person who's running the show for the Rothschilds, and I'm sure, your audience knows who the Rothschilds are. But this is the head of the chief executive officer of Rothschild and Company in South Africa, called Martin Kingston. Yeah. Right. Now, what is important here is that he established a business for South Africa entity, right? A business for South African entity. Now, you can see the caption at the top here that I'm saying, is South Africa a fascist state? And I mean, from your history, you know everything, the Italians know everything about fascism, in your history. Now, the thing I want to point at is that Martin Kingston, the CEO and chairman of Rothschild & Co. in South Africa, establishes a business for South Africa, a group. They became the most important entity advising the South African government on COVID vaccination rollout. Listen to what I'm saying. The corporate interests, they advise the South African government. And when you study the B4SA protocol, or should I say COVID-19 vaccination rules, and you study the South African government COVID-19 vaccination rule, it reads like exactly the same, So, I mean, I don't need to tell you who had enforced or informed the South African government of what they should put in. And I mean, I do want to give you here. So this is the Joint Strategic Oversight Committee on COVID-19 vaccine rollout that the government established. Let me make an emphasis on that for the Italian people listening to this interview, is that the South African government is instructed by this group, B4SA, which is run by the Rothschilds, to establish a Joint Strategic Oversight Committee on COVID-19 vaccine rollout. Yeah? And look who is the heads the team. It is Martin Kingston, as I've mentioned, right? Of course, there's two South African representatives. The Department of Health and National Treasury is represented, right? The Rothschilds. And then there's a person by the name of Casco Vardia. He is The Business Unity South Africa, BUSA, which is Business Unity South Africa, is a representative of the corporate entities in South Africa. All the corporate entities, they pay annual funds to the BUSA to become part of that, and they represent overall the business interests or corporate interests in South Africa. Another individual which is very important is Stavros Nikolai. He is the senior executive at Ashburn Pharmacare. Now, let me just explain to the people who Ashburn Pharmacare is. Ashburn Pharmacare is the pharmaceutical company that became the mRNA hub for producing 500 million doses, sanctioned by the World Health Organization, sanctioned by the Medicines Patent Pool, to become the mRNA hub for producing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine for Africa. Yeah? That is Aspen Pharmacare. These are the people that they put in charge of the vaccine rollout in South Africa. I don't need to explain to you, Paola, how this tells us how captured the South African government is, by corporate interests. The rollout of the vaccines in South Africa effectively is run by the corporate interests, and the South African government is just the puppet implementing this too. So now we haven't got much time, but
Fahrie, once again, your observations prompted me some interesting thoughts. And in particular, you mentioned the hub that the WHO has already decided is going to be born in it's going to be settled in South Africa. And in this respect, I'd like to mention that in the yet-to-be so-called pandemic treaty, there is indeed a clause that verbatim says that the states would have to implement a sort of map of existing delivery and distribution options and establish and operationalize, as appropriate, international consolidation hubs. So clearly, what is being planned by these treaties is already happening. So yet again, we observe things that are really the past. We observe that what we think is going to come is already going on, has already been planned.
Absolutely. And so basically what are you saying, and you're absolutely correct, and for the Italian people, I mean, just to qualify in the South African context, is that there's a lady that has been appointed, a South African lady. The names of, because I've got the slide later. And just to answer you, is that there's a lady that has been elected to the international negotiating body, the INB, right? The international negotiating body. And for just to qualify what the international negotiating body,
intergovernmental negotiating body,
intergovernmental negotiating body. And a South African lady has been appointed to head that body. Now, I mean, that says you a lot how captured. So the World Health Organization has appointed this individual, Motsoyo. She was appointed as a South African to this body, and the intergovernmental negotiating body basically is exactly as Paola is saying, is going to negotiate our rights away, meaning they are busy discussing how they can formalize the World Health Organization so that it becomes the de facto government of the world, and all governments around the world will then have to subject, or signatories to the World Health Organization treaty, pandemic treaty, will then have to subject their constitutions to this body. In fact, your constitution, once the World Health Organization calls a pandemic globally, it means that all constitutions around the world will basically be declared null and void, and the World Health Organization then becomes the government in that. In fact, there's one of the clauses is that they will send individuals to the government, to the country, and those individuals will then inform and advise the government of how to regulate the pandemic. And it, of course, would also mean that many of the laws would then be declared null and void. This is the thing. And the South African is being put in part. So it shows how the South African government has been totally and utterly captured by the global elite. So just, we should got a few minutes. If you look at this, now, for the Italian people, these pictures doesn't mean anything, but I will qualify. First and foremost, to the bottom right, President Cyril Ramaphosa, right, is the president of South African government. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I don't have a name, but the lady next to him is his wife. Her name is Sipho Motsepe. Yeah, Sipho Motsepe. She is Sipho Motsepe Ramaphosa, the sister of Patrice Motsepe, one of the biggest billionaires in South Africa. In fact, he is the head of Africa Rainbow Minerals, right, in South Africa, which is one of the biggest mining companies in South Africa. But I won't focus too much on him, because even though he plays a very significant role, but his wife, Dr. Precious Moloi Motsepe, very interesting. You'll see how it pans out now. Oh, by the way, why Patrice Motsepe is very important, Africa Rainbow Minerals, is he was elected as one of the board of trustees of the World Economic Forum. Wow. Okay. So it's one of the brother-in-law of the president of South Africa is elected as a board member of the World Economic Forum. So this is very important to understand that how South Africa has been captured. So his wife, Precious Moloi Motsepe, right, becomes the chancellor of the University of Cape Town, one of the biggest universities in southern Africa, maybe even Africa. University of Cape Town. She is heads the Motsepe Foundation. Now that may not ring any bells also for anybody, but here is the thing: is that the Motsepe Foundation is now in partnership with the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship. For those who may not know, the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship is headed by the wife of Klaus Schwab. So what this means is that the leading family in South Africa, but the Motsepes, who is the brother-in-law of the president of South Africa, is hand in glove with the Schwabs, Klaus Schwab of World Economic Forum. So clearly, I think I've made a clear and present case for the capture of South African government and corporate interests by the international global elites. So I cannot tell you how unfortunately, the South African public is totally unaware of these relationships, and don't know how to respond. So hopefully through this forum and, Paola, our interview, we were able to get it out to as many people as possible to warn the people about this, Now, what makes us even worse, if that isn't worse for us, Paola, now let me explain this slightly. On the right, you have the president's wife, Sipho Motsepe, who is the older sister of Patrice Motsepe, right? Next to her is Professor Helen Rees, the chairperson of SAHPRA, the South African Health Regulatory Authority, that regulates the approval of COVID vaccines and any drug in the country. Next to her, we have Professor Shabir Madhi. He is the chief vaccinologist in the country, who is the individual that ran the trials for AstraZeneca and Novavax and approves, basically is one of the individuals that gives his approval for the rollout of COVID vaccine in the country. The three of them are on the board of WITS Health Consortium. WITS is one of the top South African universities, and this is a health consortium. They are all on the WITS Health Consortium, and together they determine vaccine policy. So you ask yourself, not a wonder with Sepe as part of a non-executive director here, why the president have just keeled over. Maybe it's a case of we know who rules in that house. But clearly, not wanting to be facetious and you sound like a chauvinist or anything. The point I'm trying to make is it's quite clear, Paola, that South African government and the academia and the regulatory authorities, is captured. That makes it clear. I think that makes it clear. He shook on it. They shook on it, basically. I don't need to tell anybody in Italy, all over Italy knows who this guy is. Bill and Melinda Gates. So it's been totally captured. We've been totally and utterly captured by this. And this is just a slide. Just to run through, we've got a few minutes. Back in 2014, the South African Department of Science and Technology had signed an agreement with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for 30 minutes. So, and many of the other entities, and a year again, the South African government, in 2021, the South African government had secured 80 million in funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the COVID-19. So, for me, this is enough evidence to tell the world that the South African government has completely and utterly capitulated, to the narrative, and is actually the handmaiden of the global elite in this regard. Paola, at this stage, I don't know if we can continue because of time constraints. What I suggest is maybe we if you allow me, I enjoyed this interaction with us. If we can do maybe interview at another stage, and then we can explore. Maybe hopefully we'll have more time.
Okay, Fahrie, thank you so much. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, Paola, and thank you to the Italian people. I would love to maybe have an opportunity in the future to address them personally. Maybe come over there and address them personally. That would be wonderful.
Okay, bye bye, and see you soon in Pesaro, 1st of May then.
Yes.
Okay, bye.
Yes, lovely. I would definitely invite me. I'll certainly come. Lovely. I found it wonderful. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you again, Farid. Okay, bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye-bye.
Let's draw some conclusions now. So South Africa seems to have moved from an apartheid regime to one of controlled by big finance, foundations, private corporations. Let us consider that as early as 1994, Nelson Mandela, the then president of South Africa and the hero of the apartheid struggle, after spending 27 years in prison, he agreed in 1994, 4 years after he was released, to go to Davos and shake hands with Klaus Schwab. The same year, the future president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was accepted into the World Economic Forum as Young Global Leaders Training School. So this transition plan must have been drawn up long before we grasped its existence. What appears to us now is already in fact belonging to the past. Similarly, Fahrie, our microbiologist, announced to us the designation of South Africa under the auspices of the WHO as a hub for the production and distribution of mRNA gene therapies of 500 million to prevent future virus infections, right, supposedly. So compare this, then, I just remind you, compare this with the plan that we just discussed and was recently being discussed and will be presented at the next World Health Assembly and will be negotiated by the states. Well, yet again, we are discussing something that seems to be present, but in fact is almost the past. Well, thank you again for your time and for your attention, and I hope to see you soon again for another program of The Invisible Cities. Bye-bye.